My daughter has always been a smart and independent girl. She was not in a hurry to make important decisions, always thought things through, and was used to stability. That is why when she announced a few months ago that she was getting married, it took me by surprise. They had met less than a year ago, and although her chosen one seemed perfect, polite, caring, successful, something in me told me that everything was too smooth. But how could I doubt it when I saw that she was happy? The wedding took place quickly, without too much fuss, but with a luxury that worried me. He insisted on an expensive celebration, saying she deserved the best. My daughter has never been a spendthrift, but this time she seemed to succumb to his mood. Everything was perfect, an exquisite restaurant, musicians, expensive dresses, and flowers delivered from another city. I remember standing back and watching them, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Maybe I was just being overly suspicious. But even then, there was something in me that was uneasy. He always seemed too right, like he was playing a role. I noticed that he was very attentive to details, especially when it came to financial matters. His over-awareness of what belonged to my daughter seemed unnatural. The inheritance she was to receive was substantial. A few years ago, my father, her grandfather, passed away. He left us a large house, which I decided to sell and divide the proceeds between myself and my daughter. She was to get her share when she got married or when she turned 30. These were the terms of the will. We never talked about this money openly, because the daughter had no financial difficulties and was not interested in the inheritance. But as it turned out, someone else was. A few weeks after the wedding, we decided to have dinner together in a restaurant. A regular family dinner, me, my daughter, and her husband. He was in a great mood, full of jokes, showering her with compliments. My daughter looked happy, and I tried to convince myself that my suspicions were unfounded. Everything seemed perfect, until the moment I accidentally heard his words. My daughter went to the ladies' room, and I went a little further into the hall to answer the phone. And it was then that he spoke, not noticing me. His voice was completely different, cold, without any tenderness or care. He spoke on the phone as if he was discussing some business plan in which my daughter was only part of the scheme. He said that everything was going according to plan. That my daughter did not suspect anything and that he would soon have access to her inheritance. He said that the documents were ready and that she would sign them without even reading them because she trusted him completely. He called her naive, laughed that she had never understood finances and would not ask too many questions. He insisted that we had to act quickly while she was still in the euphoria of the wedding. My heart froze. It was like a blow. Everything that seemed real suddenly became fake. My daughter returned to the table, unsuspecting. Her husband was once again the same charming man who listened enthusiastically to her every word. I looked at him and saw a stranger in front of me. I knew the truth. And the only question was what to do with it. I was sitting at the table, but everything around me became blurry. The food lost its taste, the conversations around me turned into a distant hum. Only one thought pierced me like a blade: my daughter was living next to a predator, and she didn't even realize it. Her husband continued to play his role, a gentle look, caring gestures, a constant desire to touch her hand. I noticed every detail, every deception in his behavior. It was so obvious now. But how to tell my daughter about it? How to make her understand that the person she entrusted her life to was actually using her as a tool for his own enrichment? I knew my daughter. She is stubborn. She will protect him. If I tell her everything right now, she will think that I simply do not approve of her choice, that I am looking for a problem where there is none. And he will undoubtedly play the victim, make her believe that I'm the one who is manipulating her. I had to be smarter than that. When dinner was over, we went outside. He gently hugged her shoulders, leaned in to whisper something in her ear, and she laughed. I had seen happiness in her eyes, but now it seemed like an illusion. She didn't even realize that her marriage was just a game. He offered to give me a ride home. I refused. I needed to be alone, to digest what I had heard, to think about my next steps. I couldn't act on impulse. When I entered the apartment, a storm was raging inside. I knew I had to prove his deception. Just words would not be enough. I needed facts. I needed proof. I remembered what he had said about the documents. They were ready. But where are they? And what exactly is he planning to make her sign? I decided to start small, to see if my daughter had mentioned anything about finances recently. She had never been particularly interested in inheritance, and then suddenly her husband started preparing some papers. This should have alerted her, if she really knew about them. The next day I called her. The conversation was easy, without a hint of suspicion. I asked her how she felt after the wedding, if everything was going well. She was happy. Her voice sounded warm and carefree. I gently turned the conversation to finances, saying that maybe she needed some help with bills or payments, because after a wedding there are always many new financial issues. And then I heard something that made me squeeze the phone tighter. She said that her husband had just talked to her the other day about some legal documents. That it had something to do with her account, and that he told her to just sign it because it's standard procedure. He had already started to act. I knew that time was running out. But I had to play it safe. I couldn't just tell her, don't sign anything, because then she would suspect that I knew something. And then he would know that I knew something too. And that could be dangerous. I had to make her realize the threat herself. I offered to meet her to look at the documents together when she received them. I pretended that I just wanted to help, because these things should be checked together. She easily agreed. But I knew it wasn't enough. I had to dig deeper. If he had decided to play chess, he didn't know that he was dealing with a queen, not a pawn. I will find out the truth. And when the time comes, he will regret that he ever decided to cross our family. I knew I had to act quickly but carefully. His plan was already in motion, and if he felt threatened, he might change his tactics or, worse, accelerate his actions. So I had to get ahead of him before he could convince his daughter to sign the documents. My first step was to find out more about his past. When they first started dating, he seemed too perfect to me, polite, attentive, with a seemingly stable job. But the more I remembered, the more I realized that I didn't really know anything specific about him. I started with the simplest thing, an internet search. I looked up his name, social media, and news. At first glance, everything was clear. Too clean. No old photos, no mentions of previous jobs or studies. His profile looked as if it had been created specifically to meet my daughter. I moved on to a deeper search. Using the resources I knew, I tried to find any trace of his previous life. And finally I came across the first clue. A year ago, he was registered at a different address, in another city, and had a different job there. But what was even more interesting was that a woman with his same surname lived in the same city. What a coincidence. The feeling that I was unwinding a tangle of lies was getting stronger and stronger. I decided to go even further. The next day I contacted a lawyer I knew. I asked him to check whether there were any lawsuits, debts, or companies in my son-in-law's name. It took some time, but when the answer came back, I was amazed. It turned out that he was already married. And not just married, but divorced in rather scandalous circumstances. His ex-wife sued him for fraud. She accused him of convincing her to sign over a significant portion of her assets to him and then disappearing, leaving her with debts. It seemed that I had found confirmation of my suspicions. My next step was obvious. I had to contact the woman. I looked up her contact and wrote her a message. I didn't know if she would respond or if she would even want to talk about it. But a few hours later I received a message. She wanted to talk. I was shaking all over as I waited for the call. The room was quiet, only the clock on the wall could be heard ticking. Every second seemed like an eternity. I stared at the phone screen until it finally lit up. An unfamiliar number. I took a deep breath and picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was quiet, nervous. The woman spoke quickly, as if she was afraid of being overheard. I imagined her sitting in a dark room, looking around, afraid that someone would overhear her. She confirmed what I already knew: my son-in-law is a fraud. But when she started to tell me the details, I got goosebumps. This was not just a man who took the opportunity to live at someone else's expense. He was a hunter. Competent, cunning, cold-blooded. He gained trust, created an image of an ideal man, caring, romantic, attentive. And then, when the victim trusted him completely, he would act. A woman told me that the same thing happened to her. She fell head over heels in love. They quickly got married, and he immediately began to convince her that everything should be shared, that there is no yours and mine in marriage, that they are one team. He assured her that he would be supportive, that he wanted to protect her. And then he offered to register a part of her business for him. "It will be safer," he said. "You trust me, right?" She did. He convinced her that it was the right thing to do. And when he got access to her accounts, he disappeared. She tried to get her money back, but he had thought of everything. All the documents, all the signatures, her name was everywhere. It was as if she had given him everything herself. The court refused to help, because formally she did it voluntarily. And what about him? He just disappeared. Now he has found a new victim. My throat went dry. I closed my eyes, trying to calm down, but it was impossible. I imagined my daughter. Trusting, kind. She always believed people, always looked for the best in them. She didn't see lies because she never lied herself. And now this man took her. I could not wait. I thanked the woman for her frankness, although I realized that it would not change anything. She had lost everything, her life was ruined. But I wasn't going to let my daughter be next. I had to act. I returned home, sat in the kitchen in the dark and opened my phone. I started looking through my daughter's messages. She often sent me photos, told me about their trips, shared happy moments. Now that I knew the truth, I saw them in a completely different light. Before, I thought he was making her happy. That he really loved her. But now I saw the details. His gifts, they were always such that they could easily be returned. Jewelry that is bought without personalized engravings. Expensive gadgets that are easy to sell. He never gave her anything of real sentimental value. His words were always cunningly chosen. He praised her, but in a way that made her feel obligated to him. "I am so happy to have you. I couldn't have achieved all this without you." It sounds beautiful, doesn't it? But now I realized it was a trap. He was tying her to him, making her believe that her success was his merit as well. It was dangerous. I had a plan. I knew that if I tried to talk to my daughter directly, she would not believe me. She was in love, and love makes people blind. I had no time to waste. The next morning I did what I should have done a long time ago. I contacted a private detective. This man could not be perfectly clean. If he was really who the woman described him as, he had left traces. I had to find them. I had to save my daughter before it was too late. I met with the detective in a small office at the end of a quiet street. A middle-aged man with a penetrating gaze and a tired smile listened to my story in silence, nodding occasionally, and then opened a notebook and wrote down my son-in-law's name and basic details. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a calm understanding that he was witnessing another story of human meanness. It was impossible to hide my inner turmoil. I have never trusted people easily, but now I needed an ally to help me uncover the truth. I insisted that he was not who he seemed, that his smile hid other intentions. The detective nodded, not in a hurry to draw conclusions, but his eyes showed interest. The next few days were tense. Every call from my daughter made me tense up, catching small changes in her voice, looking for confirmation of my suspicions. She was laughing, talking about everyday things, but something was wrong. His influence was becoming more and more noticeable. Gradually, he distanced her from her friends and family, not by direct prohibitions, but by subtle manipulations. He persuaded her that true friends are those who are always there for her, and if they don't find time now, then perhaps they were never her friends in the first place. He skillfully played the role of a caring husband who just wanted to spend more time with his wife. He convinced her that they were better off alone, that the outside world only distracted them from their happiness. Every day his control was getting tighter. He didn't give her a chance to make decisions on her own, disguising it as care. He was creating a cocoon around her, where only he was left. He acted carefully, without provoking resistance, slowly but surely isolating her. I realized where this would lead. As soon as she became completely dependent on him, he would strike the decisive blow. But this time it would be different. 3 days later, the detective called back. There was no doubt in his voice that he had found something important. I returned to his office, and this time he was waiting for me with a pile of documents on his desk. His real name was different. This was not his first marriage. The story repeated itself. Each time he found a woman with money, quickly married her, convinced her that true trust meant joint finances, and then left her with nothing. Several women had already tried to sue him, but he was smart. The contracts were drawn up in such a way that he remained legally clean. But this time he made a mistake. The detective found several accounts to which he secretly transferred money from the joint assets of his victims. This time he would not get away with it. Cold, calculated anger was building inside me. He is playing with my daughter's life, convinced that he has everything under control. But he doesn't even realize that this time the game will be different. I will not wait any longer. I'm going to take action. I was sitting in the car in front of my daughter's house, peering through the bright windows. The house was silent inside, as if there had never been any real life in it. Everything around looked perfect: the manicured lawn, the expensive car in the driveway, the beautiful curtains on the windows. But it was just a shell. Inside, everything was rotten. The information the detective found finally gave me a clear picture of what was going on. He was a hunter, and my daughter was just the next victim on his list. His past was covered in lies, a fake image, failures disguised as accidents, women who disappeared from sight with their money after a relationship with him. He had thought it all through, confidently moving toward his goal, slowly, methodically, like a true predator. But he made one mistake. He didn't take me into account. I knew that telling my daughter the truth right now was risky. He already had a certain amount of control over her, and if I started to put pressure, he would only push her away from me more. So I acted differently. I started dropping small hints. I asked her about her joint accounts with her husband, about who makes financial decisions. I mentioned stories about women who had lost everything because of trust. She listened, but I could see irritation in her eyes. He had already done a good job on her. The next step was his employer. Thanks to the detective, I found out that he had gotten a job in a reputable company, posing as a man with an impeccable reputation. But now I had proof of his past. I found the head of the company and wrote him an anonymous letter, attaching all the documents I had found. A week later, he was fired. That was the first blow. I watched his reaction closely. At first, he was silent, trying not to show irritation. But as the days turned into weeks and no new job appeared, he began to lose his temper. I noticed the first changes in my daughter. She couldn't help but notice his tension. He became irritable, nervous, often left the house, returned late, and locked himself in his office. The perfect picture of his personality began to show cracks. But that was not enough. The next step was to destroy his reputation with his friends and acquaintances. I began to spread the truth carefully, not directly, but through casual conversations, through friends who would pass the information on. People quickly began to put the puzzle together. His mask began to crack. His daughter noticed the changes. He became tense, irritable, often left the house and came back irritated. Her ideal picture of him began to crumble. But she still clung to the hope that these were temporary difficulties, that he was not what everyone said he was. The last step was the most painful. I handed her the documents that confirmed that her account was almost empty. All her money had been secretly transferred to another account. He acted faster than I thought. She read the papers, and her eyes finally showed understanding. The world she was building with him collapsed in an instant. That night she couldn't sleep. I sat next to her, silently waiting for the pain to change to rage. The next morning he came home and saw her with her suitcases. That was the end point. He tried to talk, to explain, but this time his words meant nothing. His daughter did not leave him a single chance. He left, leaving only emptiness behind.